People talk about closure, but what if the person who holds your truth doesn't want to give it back? In episode 1, Claire returns to her childhood home and finds a hidden leather notebook listing 7 names, one of which is her own. The first person she visits is Mrs. Lorna, an old neighbor, who reminds Claire of a night she ran away at 17. But the memory is fragmented, faded, and terrifying in its silence. In episode 2, Claire meets Mr. Gavin, her former literature teacher, who lost everything after a letter, allegedly written by her, accused him of misconduct. The handwriting was hers. The memory wasn't. Claire leaves, unable to forgive him or herself. Now, she turns a page, and the next name is someone who once knew everything. Becca, her best friend, the one who disappeared. Becca Rowe. The name stood clear on the page, as if time had never been enough to fade her from memory. But Claire couldn't remember exactly how they drifted apart. All she remembered was there was no goodbye, no dramatic fight. Just one day, Becca stopped texting, stopped showing up, stopped existing in the parts of Claire she could still name. They had once been 2 halves of a small world no one else could enter, and somehow that world collapsed, without even the sound of an explosion. It took Claire 3 days to trace Becca's footsteps. No matching social media profiles. Old classmates only said she left after that summer. No one knew why. No one asked. Eventually, Claire stumbled across an old high school blog post. Becca had once written about her dream of opening a small cafe in the neighboring town. Claire went there. The cafe was small, warm, charming, dried flowers hanging from the ceiling, soft indie music drifting through the air. Behind the counter stood a young woman with long brown hair tied back. Same eyes, but colder, quieter, like someone who had survived a long internal drought. Claire froze at the doorway. Becca saw her, paused mid-pour. They looked at each other for a long time. Neither spoke. Finally, Becca said, her voice calm, not surprised. "You came." "Yeah," Claire replied, soft as a confession. Becca gestured to the last table in the back. Claire walked toward it, her heart pounding like she was approaching a version of herself at 17, wounded, guarded, and never really healed. Claire sat down at the last table in the cafe, where the afternoon sunlight crawled through a glass window, spilling across the surface in a faint glow like a memory just beginning to unfold. Becca brought out the coffee. She didn't ask what Claire wanted, didn't ask how Claire found her. She set the cup down as if Claire sitting there wasn't some seismic event, just something that should have happened a long time ago. Claire reached out and placed a notebook on the table. Becca didn't look at it right away. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from Claire, her posture straight, like someone ready to enter a quiet courtroom. "You know your name is in here, right?" Claire asked, her voice hoarse. Becca nodded. "You wrote it." Claire didn't know what hurt more, that chillingly cold answer or the feeling that Becca was no longer the person who once held her together through nights of panic and trembling. Claire didn't react. She opened the notebook, pointed to the name Becca Rowe. No extra words, no notes, just a name lying in the middle of a fragmented list. Becca looked at it, then let out a small laugh, not bitter, not tender, just the kind of laugh of someone who has learned how to give up feeling after too many wounds. "You really don't remember anything?" Becca asked, emphasizing each word. Claire shook her head. Becca looked down at the coffee cup in front of her, stayed silent for a long moment, then said, "That summer, I was the only one who knew you weren't okay. I saw you shaking in class, losing sleep, avoiding your mom. And then I read your journal, not because you gave it to me, because you forgot it in your desk drawer." Claire looked up, blinking fast. "You wrote a lot," Becca continued. Not clearly, but there was one part. "If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone except Becca." That sentence stabbed into Claire like a rusted blade. Not because it was sharp, but because it was so painfully familiar. Becca pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She placed it on the table, not sliding it toward Claire, just laying it there like evidence that needed no verification. I kept it all these years because I thought one day you'd need it. Claire looked at the paper, but didn't dare to touch it. Her eyes stung. The hand resting on the notebook began to tremble. And then you disappeared, Becca said, her voice even, without blame. 2 weeks. Not a word. No message. You didn't come back to school. And when you did, you acted like I had never existed. And you asked why I left. Claire opened her mouth to say something, but fell silent. She had no defense, nowhere left to hide. Claire couldn't remember ever feeling this small, not because the cafe was too big, but because she was sitting across from someone who had once held every fragile version of her, and now looked at her like an old witness. Becca sat there, not angry, not raising her voice, not crying, and that was what made Claire want to break down. She didn't even know what she was apologizing for disappearing, for forgetting, or for placing a piece of the truth in Becca's hands, then never coming back to reclaim it. I kept that paper, not because I was afraid something would happen, Becca said. I kept it because I thought it was the one thing you left behind that you couldn't take back. Claire lowered her head. She remembered, not the image, but the feeling of writing that sentence, sweaty palms, spinning head, and a voice in her mind repeating over and over, "No one's going to believe you." She used to think she imagined it, that every fear was just a symptom of exhaustion. But now, hearing Becca repeat those words, they echoed like they'd never been buried. "Do you know who read the journal?" Claire asked. Becca shook her head. "I think it was your mom." Or, she paused, her eyes darkening, or someone else in the house. But I'm not sure. All I know is, after I kept that paper, everything started to change. Claire stared at Becca. "You said change how?" Becca looked at her for a long time, then quietly said, "I started to feel watched. One time I got an envelope. No writing, no name, but the handwriting on the outside. It looked just like yours. Then one day, when I saw your dad watching me through the fence behind your house, I knew there was something I wasn't supposed to know." Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never heard Becca mention her father. It had been a long time since anyone in the family even spoke of him. He was gone, but the memory of him clung like a shadow, shapeless but cold. Becca saw Claire stiffen and her tone softened. "I don't know exactly what happened between you and him. I didn't dare ask, but I know you chose silence, and I don't blame you for that. I just didn't know what to do with that piece of paper." Claire wanted to say something, a clear explanation, a vivid memory, but all she had was a knock at the door in the middle of the night, the soft footsteps in the hallway, and her mother's eyes, always avoiding, always fading. Every time Claire said, "Mom, something's wrong," Claire closed her eyes. She felt something break open in her chest, not like a blow, but like an old, deep jam finally releasing. She wasn't sure why she felt lighter after what Becca said, even though everything Becca shared could have crushed her. Maybe because finally, someone had acknowledged that what she felt at 17 wasn't a hallucination. She hadn't been crazy. She hadn't been weak. She had simply lived in a house filled with an unnamed darkness, and everyone had learned to survive it by never calling it what it was. "Did you ever mean to tell me that?" Claire asked, eyes still closed. Becca answered slowly. "I wrote a letter once, but I didn't send it, because I thought if I brought it up, you'd bury it even deeper." Claire opened her eyes. "I really did forget." "No," Becca shook her head. "You didn't forget. You just shut it away, like locking a room and throwing away the key. But everything's still in there." Claire felt a sting rise in her nose. Her hand tightened around the edge of the table. "I don't know which of my memories I can still believe. You don't have to believe the memories, Becca said. You just have to believe your feelings. And the reason I stayed that long is because I believed yours, even when you didn't. That was when Claire broke down, not from pain, but because finally someone had believed her, long before she had learned to believe herself. Becca didn't rush to console her. She sat still, her eyes never leaving Claire, not watching like an observer, but guarding something fragile beginning to stir. I'm not mad that you disappeared, Becca said. I was angry because you came back and didn't ask anything, like I was just a side character. Claire nodded, tears still falling. You're not a side character. Becca let out a faint laugh. I used to be the only person you trusted, but then I disappeared from your story too. So much that you needed to write a notebook just to remember. Claire looked at the notebook. The folded paper Becca had kept still lay on top. She knew forgiveness wasn't something that happened overnight, but maybe it started with a single sentence. I remember now. Claire held the paper in both hands, as if afraid it might shatter. The handwriting was hers. There was no denying that. The blue ink had faded, but the words still stood out clearly. If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone except Becca. She read it again and again, like she was trying to pull something back from deep inside her chest, where trust once lived, where fear had rooted, and where now both tangled so tightly they were indistinguishable. Did you ever think I was someone who needed saving? Claire asked, her voice trembling like a child's. Becca looked at her for a long moment, then nodded gently. I did, but I didn't know how to save you. I only knew how to stay quiet, and stay. Claire let out a soft, crooked laugh, bitter and bent. You stayed. I didn't. You stayed inside me, Claire, Becca replied, even when I didn't want you to, even when I tried to forget. A chill crept up Claire's neck, a familiar sensation, the kind that always came right before memories surfaced like water rising to her throat. She closed her eyes, breathed slowly, and let the images appear. Her hallway, the dim yellow nightlight, soft shuffling footsteps, someone's hand on her shoulder, not rough, not violent, but wrong. So wrong her whole body tensed. She saw herself folding in. She saw herself wanting to scream, but her voice was far away. And then she ran. Somehow, she didn't know how, didn't remember the path, but she saw Becca's door open. And there she was, sitting in Becca's kitchen, breathing like someone pulled from the bottom of a lake. Claire opened her eyes. Her heart pounded like she'd just run a marathon. I came to your house that night, didn't I? Becca nodded. You stayed until morning. Didn't say a word. Just sat. I didn't ask. Claire swallowed, throat dry. Did you ever think I made it all up? No, Becca said firmly. I think you were forced to forget. Claire dropped her head onto the table, tears spilling into the crook of her arm. Not from shame, not from anger, but because finally, memory wasn't something she had to run from. It was something she had moved through and survived. They sat in silence for a long time, as if afraid any sound might shatter the air. Thin as ice over the heart of a lake, Claire slowly sat up, wiped her tears, and took a deep breath. You left because of me? Becca looked at her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of anger in her eyes. Not sharp, but honest. I left because I was scared. Not of you, of what I knew. Scared that if I stayed, I'd be the next target. Claire listened without reacting. She understood. And the hardest part was how deeply she understood. That feeling of no one believing her. That feeling of having only one person who knew. But that person had to choose between loyalty and safety. I don't blame you, Claire said. I just remember. Becca nodded. So do I. I remember who you were back then. Fragile, but brave. You didn't run from your feelings. You were just taught to lock them away. Claire nodded. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. She simply existed, as if her presence alone was enough. Becca placed the paper back on top of the notebook. I don't know what this means anymore, but if you want to forgive me, yourself, anyone, maybe start by keeping it. Claire looked down. She folded the paper and tucked it into the back cover of the notebook. I'll keep it, not because it was a warning, but because it's proof that someone once believed me, even when I couldn't. Becca gave a soft smile. You've changed. Claire nodded. So have you. They sat like that, saying nothing more, but between them, a rhythm had returned. Not of two people they used to be, but of two who had once lost each other to fear and found each other again through courage. Claire stood. She knew it was time to go, but before she walked out the door, she turned back and said softly, "Thank you for holding on to what I forgot." Becca didn't answer. She just nodded, and this time, Claire left, but she didn't feel lost. Claire stepped out of the cafe just as the sun dipped fully behind a row of townhouses. The last light of the afternoon spilled onto the sidewalk like a thin mist, no longer warm, but enough to stretch her shadow long behind her. She didn't look back. There was no need to any more. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be held onto, Becca had held for her all these years. And the rest, Claire knew, was hers to carry. She walked slowly down the street, the soft hum of cars behind her, the sound of wind chimes from a shop across the road. Everything quiet, but not still, like her own inner world at that moment. Not chaotic, but not yet at peace. Instead, there was a strange kind of stillness, one Claire hadn't felt since the day she first opened the notebook again. It wasn't quite serenity, but it was acceptance. When she got home, Claire didn't turn on the lights right away. She set her bag on the chair, took off her coat, then sat on the wooden floor of the living room, where the glow of the streetlight seeped gently through the curtains. She opened the notebook, flipped through the pages, looked at the names she had faced. Lorna, Gavin, Becca, each one a scar, each meeting a reopened wound, but also a patch of new skin slowly growing. She knew she hadn't fully forgiven anyone, but the truth was she no longer held resentment either. Each conversation had drawn her closer to something deeper than memory, emotional truth, and if forgiveness wasn't about erasing, but about being able to face what happened without shrinking from in fear, then maybe she had already begun to forgive. She closed the notebook and set it on the table. In the quiet darkness of her home, nothing threatened her now. No sudden footsteps, no vague calls in the night. Only herself with herself. And in the rhythm of her breathing, Claire knew what she had to face next would no longer be someone else. Claire went upstairs just as the wall clock struck 10. She didn't turn on the lights. Moonlight shimmered across the ceiling, casting soft silver trails over old photo frames, forgotten corners, and unopened drawers. She walked to her vanity, pulled out the chair, and sat down across from the old mirror, the same mirror that had been there since she was 12, where she once wrote dreams in lipstick, cried in the dark, and asked herself if she was imagining everything. She looked at herself. Her eyes were still red, but no longer frightened. It wasn't the gaze of someone trying to figure out where she went wrong, but of someone learning to accept that maybe she hadn't. Maybe it had simply been too early to understand what was right. On the table, she reached for the notebook and flipped to the next page. And for the first time, she let her eyes linger on the name without looking away. Mom. No full name, no surname, just one handwritten word. Slightly slanted, simple, but carrying an entire lifetime of shadows. Claire didn't know where to begin, didn't know if she was ready. But she knew one thing. If the next conversation didn't happen, then everything before would only be patchwork. She set the notebook down, braced her hands against the edge of the mirror, and she whispered, so softly it felt like even she might not hear it. I need to ask you something, Mom. Just that, but it was everything Claire hadn't been able to say for the past 10 years. Outside, the night wind slipped through the cracks in the window like a sigh. Inside Claire, There was an emptiness waiting to be filled, not with answers, but with truth. Tomorrow morning, she would speak to her mother, not to accuse, but to name the thing both of them had tried not to face. And then, after that, Claire would know whether she still had room for one last forgiveness, or not. Episode 3 marks the first time Claire doesn't seek the truth alone, but faces it alongside someone who once witnessed everything and chose to stay. Her meeting with Becca doesn't erase the years of silence between them, but it helps Claire reconnect with something even more vital: her 17-year-old self and the emotions she had buried out of fear and shame. This episode shows that forgiveness doesn't always begin with an apology. Sometimes it starts with someone brave enough to say, "I believe you were hurt," even if you can't explain why. Claire may not remember every detail that night, but she remembers a feeling, and Becca, who once kept that fragment of memory safe, confirmed it was real. Claire hasn't fully forgiven, but for the first time, she called a pain by its true name, and that, on its own, began to make it dissolve. If you've ever lost someone simply because you couldn't speak your truth or stayed silent for so long that you no longer knew if you were still believed, share your story in the comments. Your words might reach someone else living in that same silence. If this journey is stirring something within you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode. Episode 3 ends with a new page in the notebook, a single heavy name, Mom. Claire isn't stepping back anymore, because the next conversation she needs to have is no longer with someone else.